Ja, så går vi i gang med anden runde her. Og det vil sige, at I har nu mulighed for at komme med spørgsmål og kommentarer og indvendinger. Og dem, der kan gøre det på engelsk, er jo meget velkommen til det. Hvis I synes, det er vanskeligt, så kan I jo prøve at gøre det på dansk, så skal vi se, om vi kan få det oversat til et forståeligt engelsk. Welcome, and please ask questions and comments.
I'll try to explain it in English. So morality is based upon a God, the lawgiver. If there's a law, there should be a lawgiver. And it sums up in the reaction, you said, that if we, for an example, there's someone steals my computer, then I would say that's wrong.
That's one way we know it. Yes,
Yeah.
there's one way.
Yeah, that was one way
Yes.
that you pointed out. But my question concerns if we were to say that in Islam, they would say that their God is also moral and perfect in his morality.
Actually, let me just say one thing about
Yeah.
that. Muslims don't really say that. What they say is whatever God does is good. So if Allah decides to do X, X suddenly becomes good. They don't believe that God is essentially good. God is more arbitrary. So that's why they have no security in what Allah is going to do, because one day Allah can tell them to do X and the next day He can tell them to do non-X. And so the Muslim God in theological terms is more of a voluntaristic God. That's a God who's arbitrary, as opposed to a Christian God who is more essential, that his nature doesn't change, so his moral precepts don't change.
Okay, so if Allah's morale changes, then I guess the question is kind of irrelevant. The question, I can explain though. The question was just that if the will of Allah, for example, the morality of Allah was unchangeable, then they would say, for example, if we take one of these moral self-evident wrongs, for an example that's rape or something,
Right.
then they would say that it's the punishment from Allah. And Allah is moral, so therefore the morality would be, well, against what our reaction would imply. So therefore the question of an self-evident and unchangeable morality is suddenly confronted over.
Well, I think the self-evident, unchangeable morality is on the big issues. It's not on the implications and the smaller issues of morality. It's on issues of murder and theft and rape. It's, we may differ on less serious moral issues, but on the essential moral issues, everybody basically agrees because it's coming from the same source. So there may be instances, in fact we were talking about this in the car, there may be instances when commands from God change, but the value behind the command doesn't change. Circumstances change, so the command changes. For example, in the Old Testament, God had all of these dietary laws for Israel. Why? What was the purpose of these dietary laws? The purpose of the dietary laws were to show Israel they needed to be separate from the other nations, that they needed to be holy or set apart. Those laws can change because the theocracy is over with regard to Israel. But the value behind those laws doesn't change. Be holy, be separate. It's how the command is expressed, or how that value is expressed by the command that can change. And we do this with our kids, right? When our children are young, we say, don't play in the street, right? What's the value behind the command? That life is precious and we don't want you to hurt yourself. But we don't tell a man who's 50 years old, don't play in the street unless they're nuts. We still care for the 50-year-old man, but we have a different command now, right? We may say, don't drive drunk. You're not going to tell a 5-year-old kid not to drive drunk because the 5-year-old doesn't drive. Okay? So the command may change, but the value behind the command always stays the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But It was more about the general morale. If there was another religion that would say that the bad thing that has happened is the punishment from the morality, from the being,
Oh, you
from
mean
the theistic God.
So there are negative consequences to bad behavior.
No, that the negative consequence that happened is not. It's not that it's not based upon your reaction whether you feel it's wrong or not. It's the punishment from God.
Well, there are times when you may not feel wrong. In fact, sociopaths don't feel wrong. That's why they can continue to kill. They intellectually know it's wrong, but they don't have the feeling of guilt. But we would consider that a defect. Just because some people don't have a feeling that something is wrong doesn't mean that it isn't wrong. Just like some people are colorblind, but that doesn't mean colors don't exist, because some people are colorblind. So it might be a deficiency in somebody who doesn't feel that something's wrong, even though intellectually they know it's wrong. So, were you going to say, you're going to add something?
I was just going to make a further clarification on the point that Frank was making earlier. And if you got any philosophy majors in here, you guys know about the Euthyphro dilemma by Plato? Who knows about the Euthyphro dilemma? Anybody? Okay. You guys don't know about the Euthyphro? The theology students should know about the Euthyphro dilemma. It's basically a debate that was asked by Euthyphro to Plato, and the question was, is it good because God wills it, or is God identical with the good? And the Christian idea, at least I think as Aquinas would answer it, and other theologians, is that God doesn't do anything apart from who He is. That the good does come from the metaphysical nature of God. And so that would be the difference between a Muslim concept of God versus a Christian concept of God. In other words, Allah is sort of, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason in the Quran. He does some of this, but whatever Allah wills. Whereas the Christian God always acts in accordance with His nature, His metaphysical nature. So whatever attributes God has, whatever they are, God is a simple being, so He's not physical, He's uncomposed, He's a spirit. So whatever He has, whatever attributes that God has, He has these eternally, and He has them perfectly. So whatever God says and whatever God does is in accordance with His will. It's essential nature. God always acts in accordance with the good. So theologically, that's a little background on the question Frank was making earlier, the point Frank was making earlier.
Okay. Somebody was over here. You had a question, sir?
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
go ahead.
Yes, because you said from a materialistic point of view, my moral values and, say, Hitler's moral values are just like a question of taste. But you didn't really mention the opinion of the Jews, for example. I mean, would it be possible to say that morals are constituted by, not my opinion, but by the opinion of the victims? So that, like, moral always exists in the relation between me and the person who is the victim of my moral actions. Is it clear?
Well, obviously somebody doesn't like it when you try and kill them. But if there was no God, it wouldn't be objectively morally wrong to kill them. There has to be a standard beyond Hitler and the Jews for us to say that Hitler was objectively wrong for trying to kill the Jews. If there's no God, then, in fact, Hitler, I don't know if you've ever read Mein Kampf, but My Struggle, as you know, in Deutsch. And he wrote that in 1922, maybe. And if you read Mein Kampf, basically what Hitler uses is evolutionary theory to justify murdering the Jews. He says if the weak do not want to fight, they have no right to exist, because nature is on an inexorable path toward an evolutionary form of a higher being. And he thought the Jews, the homosexuals, the gypsies, the Jehovah's Witnesses were inferior beings and were interfering with evolution. So he said we have the right to kill them. It's survival of the fittest. And that's why Richard Dawkins, to his credit, says, I believe in Darwinism, but not Darwinian morality. The problem is he's stealing morality from God to say, don't do it the Darwinian way. You see, he's stealing morality from God in order to say that I'm not for the Darwinian morality. Well, if Darwin is right and there is no God and we're just molecular machines, then the Darwinian morality is just the way things are. I don't know if I answered it, but
Yeah,
I answered the question I wanted to answer. It was your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be possible to say that my moral value as a person would be that, I have consciousness, and we know from experience that we can suffer and we can feel happiness, and we know from experience that if I help someone, it will make this person happy, and if I hurt someone, yeah, it will be bad. So
Yes.
that is why, yeah.
You're right that we can discover the right thing to do by seeing the consequences sometimes. And Sam Harris is right about that. When he says science can help us discover what human flourishing, or how to make somebody flourish, like a scientist can figure out if you give somebody arsenic, they're going to die. If you give them insulin, if they're a diabetic, you're going to help them live, so you ought to give them insulin. Science can help you do that. But science can't tell you whether you ought to help somebody. Whether you ought to help somebody, that's a moral law that science can't deal with. Science has nothing to say about it. Science is morally neutral. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you have shown that atheism, as defined as physicalism, cannot in any way sustain a objective moral theory. And you have also shown that on a theistic theory, a moral theory could be grounded, but you haven't in any way addressed any other metaphysical principles which would be adequate with a theistic theory, but could sustain a moral, objective moral.
What would those be? Platonism or?
Anything. There are plenty of theories which are probably problematic, but any of them or some of them could at least be reasonable. And you haven't in any way shown that the theistic theory is better than those. It could be, for example, reason, or just stating that moral in itself is a metaphysical principle that is ontologically in the world governing.
Well, let's take Platonism, because that's probably the most popular, that there are these forms out there, these moral forms, that maybe there's such a thing as justice and love and vice and virtue and selfishness and greed, whatever these moral categories are. Let's say they really do exist. I can't see ontologically why they would exist without a personal being, because in order to have morality, you have to have a person. You don't have a moral obligation in impersonal forces. You have a moral obligation to persons. Like, for example, if you go try and dunk a basketball, you're not sinning against the law of gravity, right? That's an impersonal force.
That seems to be begging the question. You're saying morality can only be defined if it's or morality can only be grounded in personality, and therefore you can say we have a lawgiver and that must be God because it has to be personal. But on a ontological theory stating that reason or just morality ontological is governing, that is by definition not a personal theory of morality.
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Who do we have these moral obligations to? Like, for example, let's suppose these Platonic forms actually exist. That love exists, but so does selfishness. Why am I under any obligation to obey love and not selfishness?
Well, that's because that's in accordance with nature.
No, nature is...
Yeah, nature.
Both of those exist independently if they do exist independently. Why do I have to pick love over selfishness?
Oh, okay. In the action of not hitting someone, in the state of not hitting, there is connected the ontological category of virtue. Or in the action of hitting someone, there is connected the ontological category of vice. Therefore, it's in accordance with nature to do the one or the other. So, if I want to be in accordance with virtue, I cannot hit. And then you ask, but why?
Oh, no, hang on a second. Let me make. What's your name, by the way?
Jacob.
Jacob. Okay, let me make sure I understand this right. You're saying that love is in accordance with nature, but selfishness is not. Why? If they both exist in nature,
Sure,
aren't they both
you have to have
natural?
some kind of principle in order to choose between the one category or the other. And that's true. So Platonism is false. But why not reason? Reasoning saying it's more reasonable to choose the category of virtue other than vice.
How can reason give you a moral law?
On a theory of Kantian ethics is doing exactly that. So you have to show that Kantian ethics does not hold.
Well, Kant believed in God, so Kant had a moral lawgiver.
No, he said, yes, God does exist, but he is not necessary for the existence of morality.
Well, but he would have to give a reason as to what moral authority is out there that has the authority to tell us what to do. So, what moral authority, absence of God, can tell us what to do?
don't know. It seems to be begging the question. It seems to be if we define morality in this way, we need some kind of personal dictation of what to do. Then it leads to an argument for God. But if we define morality as just in accordance with reason, because that is in some way.
Well, all right. Let me give you Stalin's view on this. Okay, Stalin, who originally was a seminary student and rebelled against God, thought it was reasonable for him to murder every one of his enemies because then he could get what he wanted. And he did. He died on his deathbed at the age of 74, shaking his fist at God one last time. That was perfectly reasonable inside of his worldview. And in fact, if there is no God, Stalin did for him what brought him the most happiness in this life. And he'll pay for none of it, because if there's no God, he's just dead. Following reason, that's where Stalin wound up. Why shouldn't he have done that?
But that's again equivocating between epistemic and ontological. If we believe in reason as an ontological category, then it would not be accordant. Stalin would not be accordant to reason in doing so.
How not? How not? What,
he would believe it because he was epistemic wrong, but ontological he would be against.
I'm not following you. I'm not following you, Jacob. If these things really exist, if selfishness and love really exist on a worldview without a personal moral authority, why does anyone have to adhere to love rather than selfishness? If you can come up with a system, I'm open to hearing that, but every system I've heard of in some way smuggles in a moral law in order to make it work. So, and maybe someone else can jump in. Maybe I'm missing something. That could be the case, but I don't see any other system out there that is, I mean, have you studied any, Ted?
Yeah.
Anybody else? I mean, if there's another way of getting an objective moral law where people are obligated to obey a certain code, other than God, what is it? He has one. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But what was your name, Jacob? Or,
Yeah.
I really like your question, and by the way, I do agree with your points. But I just started to think about why don't a pack of lions attack each other? Why don't they kill each other? This is not really anything that I've been what's that called? Thinking all about. But the whole psychological way of thinking, like the selfishness, that's very much about survival of the fittest. But there are some theories as well saying you love because it is something that will benefit you. For instance, the lions probably don't attack each other because they have a benefit of being a pack, that they can hunt together and stuff like this. So saying that their acting, their behaviorism there needs to be a God who told them how to behave, that they needs to serve him or they have something to fulfill. I just think I do agree that you need to respond to this psychological theory about whether or not it could be something that we have developed for us to fit in as society, as social beings.
Well,
Does that make sense?
oh yes, I certainly agree that many times people will say that in order for us to have a cooperative society, we need to love more than hate. We all agree on that. But that doesn't tell a Stalin or a Castro or a Hitler that it's morally wrong for them to hate in order to get what they want. Because they don't have to cooperate to get what they want. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of times by not cooperating, you can really get ahead. That's what crime's all about, right? So, I mean, lying isn't true, but it works sometimes, doesn't it? It can get you out of trouble. So why not do it if it can benefit you? In other words, sometimes sinning actually benefits you. Short term.
And I know a lot of people who would actually say, yes, sometimes I lie because it is a good thing both for me and others.
Oh, well, see, now they're smuggling in a moral law again. That it's good. What do you mean by good? Or what do you mean by benefits? Why should we benefit one another? That's the very question. See, that's...
Yeah, but once again, it was also what would benefit them.
And them, and but quite frequently, as you know, you have to do things that don't directly benefit you in order to take care of others. In fact, that's what Christ did. Christ sacrificed himself to benefit us. It was no good for him. He died as a man. We're the ones that benefit.
I totally agree.
Anyway, Jacob, tomorrow night we're going to be in this room. So if you find something, bring it up again tomorrow night and we'll talk about it. Is that all right? Okay. We're going to be in this room talking about other arguments for God, but we can talk about that too. Good question.
Carsten?
I have two questions, unrelated, but I'll just start with the first one. It's a question about the God of the gaps reasoning.
Yes.
On one of your first slides, you had like two premises and a conclusion, and the conclusion about a moral lawgiver was it followed from the premises that
yes.
there has to be an absolute moral lawgiver. And you had one example that when you see a book, you don't just assume that the book just got there. You think there has to be an author.
Right.
And examples in the same with the same meaning. So, but my question is, if I know that I suspect that you'll say it's not God of the gaps reasoning, but I'll ask anyway.
It's not God of the gaps reasoning.
It seems to me that you're just pushing the problem one step, because when I see an objective moral lawgiver, I just like with the law, I don't assume that the moral lawgiver just came into existence. It's still an explanation problem. I think two people had sex, and then 30 years later was the moral lawgiver. It's, it's just pushing the explanation, I think. And the same when I see a book, of course, I think there has to be an author. But when I see an author, that author also had to come from somewhere. And in this examples too,
Are you asking who made God? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question. But we're about out of time. No. Actually, tomorrow night.
It's the same reasoning.
Yes. Tomorrow night we're going to go through the arguments for the existence of God. The first two, the cosmological and teleological. But let me just give you the punchline. And that is, the evidence shows both from science and from philosophy that the universe, space, time, and matter had a beginning out of nothing. So once there was no space, there was no time, there was no matter, and then the entire space-time continuum leapt into existence. You even have atheists admitting the data, like Stephen Hawking and the great agnostic from Tufts University, Alexander Vilenkin, who says, look, it's been proven the universe had a beginning. So if the universe had a beginning, whatever caused the universe, if space-time and matter had a beginning, can't be made of space-time and matter. See, if space-time and matter had a beginning, the cause can't be made of space-time or matter. The cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Now, if you're timeless, do you have a beginning? No. If you're timeless, you didn't have a beginning. So if God exists, he's timeless, he's uncreated. And for many years, atheists had no problem believing in an eternal universe. They thought the universe was eternal and uncaused. But in the 20th century, when scientific discovery after scientific discovery seemed to show the universe had a beginning, and theists kept saying, well, okay, the universe isn't uncaused, but whatever created the universe is uncaused, then suddenly the atheists are going, oh, we can't believe in an eternal God. We could believe in an eternal universe, but now we can't believe in an eternal God. Why not? I mean, if you had no trouble believing in an uncaused eternal universe, why can't you believe in an uncaused eternal God? Look, Aristotle knew this. There had to be an unmoved mover, right? There had to be something that is uncaused and gives motion or change to everything else. And what science has now shown, and what, of course, philosophical arguments have shown, is that there is an unmoved mover, and it's not made of space, it's not made of matter, it's not in time, so it's completely uncaused. And this is the problem, and it goes back to your question about God of the gaps. this is the problem that Richard Dawkins has. Richard Dawkins is arguing against a God of the gaps God. He's arguing against a God who's inside the universe like Zeus or like Thor. Not a immaterial, spaceless, timeless, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator. And here's where God and Richard Dawkins agree. God says idols don't exist, and so does Richard Dawkins. They're in agreement. But the kind of God that Richard Dawkins is criticizing is the same kind of God the God of the Old Testament is criticizing. Idols don't exist. Zeus doesn't exist. Thor doesn't exist. Only I exist. A spaceless, immaterial, timeless, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator.
Fair enough. Is it okay to go with my second question?
Sure.
Thank you. You say that atheists can't, atheists can recognize morality. They can act. They can act in
Morally.
They can act morally. Yes. But they can't define why, and they can't define what absolute moral is, or what absolute.
Though they can define it, they can't justify where it comes from. They know it, they can define it, they can live it, but they can't explain where it comes from. It's like saying they can see this book, they can read it, they can understand it, but they can't justify where it comes from because they deny there's an author.
Okay. Because my question was going along the lines of how you determine what is absolutely good. Before you said the thing about the Bible is not really necessary. I mean, it would give you more details, you said, but it's not really necessary because we all have this sense. Before you said that, I was thinking, then isn't it just your subjective interpretation of the Bible?
Well, everyone has an interpretation. The question is the interpretation what was intended, if you're looking at the Bible, by the text? So everyone has an interpretation, but that doesn't mean everyone's interpretation is wrong, right? Somebody might have the right interpretation. So yes, obviously I'm a subject that has to interpret. The question is, do I have it right or not? And that's for you to decide. And I think C.S. Lewis has done a lot of groundwork on this, as I mentioned before. If you want to read a book when it comes to the moral law, other than mere Christianity, which goes into the fact that cultures around the world agree on the essential moral core, you need to read The Abolition of Man. Because Lewis investigates all these different cultures and comes to the general conclusion that they all agree on the core morality. They may disagree on some peripheral areas out here, but they all agree on the core morality. But you know what? That argument actually isn't necessary to prove God exists. In order to prove that God exists, there only has to be one thing that's morally wrong. Like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Like it's wrong to murder people. If those things are wrong, God exists. Even if we disagree on everything else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's not too convincing, Carson. Yeah, I guess so. There's a lot more in the book on that.
Lad mig lige indskyde, at både Mere Christianity og Abolition of Man er oversat til dansk, og hedder jo altså bliver kristendom som Mere Christianity, og Menneskets udslettelse, som udkom på et lille forlag nede i nærheden af Vejle for 10 år siden. Det er Abolition of Man. Begge er udkommet på dansk.
Did he just say what I thought he said? Did he agree with me or not?
Translated to Danish.
Oh, very good.
Christopher?
Yeah, I'll try to say it in English. Actually, I agree with you, but I was wondering if evolution is true, wouldn't that explain why we feel like we have objective moral? I feel like it's wrong to kill Jews, you showed the picture, because I want to reproduce. And I've experienced that girls don't like people who think it's okay to kill Jews. So of course I would think it was wrong. Unconsciously I would base my moral on what would make me reproduce and make me able to have kids with some woman.
Or women. Don't be so narrow-minded.
And like Hitler thought that the Jews weren't strong enough to be part of the world, like survival of the fittest. He just thought we got to kill him. I think it's wrong because my evolutionary process is going another way and I'm on another step. What do you think about that?
Okay, good question on evolution, because that question comes up a lot. So let's deal with the questions directly. Can evolution account for morality? First of all, moral laws are not chemical or biological. They are immaterial and come from personal agents. So you don't get a moral law from a biological process. Biology and morality are in different categories. One is a physical process, and the other, of course, is an immaterial law. Chemistry and biology are descriptive. They are not prescriptive. Evolution describes what does survive, not what ought to survive. Why humans? Why these humans? Why not the Nazi humans? Why should the Jews survive on evolution if the Nazis are stronger? Also, should we rape to survive? I mean, if evolution is our standard and our goal is to survive and to pass our genes on, then why not rape to survive? Should we murder the weak to help others survive? That's exactly what Hitler did. Hitler said, we've got limited resources here. We want to make sure that these weak individuals are not taking these limited resources from the strong, so we're going to kill the weak. Of course, since evolution is a process of change, then morals must change. Rape may one day be considered good on evolution. And finally, why cooperate when not cooperating often helps you survive? I already mentioned that earlier. So you can survive yourself if you kill all your enemies. So why not do that on evolution? Of course, what you said in the beginning was absolutely right. If evolution is true, evolution might give us the feelings that we ought to behave in a certain way. But again, that's epistemology, that's not ontology. That's how you know what the right thing is, but it doesn't explain why the right thing exists to begin with. And the right thing is an immaterial law promulgated by an unchanging moral lawgiver who has authority over human beings. That's what we mean by God. Evolution can't do that. Evolution is just a biological process, if it's true at all.
Yeah, one more question. If I agree with you, then we have to show that rape have been wrong in all time. We have to show that, for example, when Plato and Aristotle had intimacy with younger boys, that it was also wrong at that time, and I think that was what C.S. Lewis was trying to do in the Abolition of Man. But can we really show that, or haven't morals just changed?
You don't have to show that, and here's the reason why. Even if people disagree on morality, subjective disagreement doesn't mean there are no objective truths about morality any more than scientific disagreement means there are no objective truths about nature. You know, some scientists say light is a wave, others say it's a particle, others say it's both. Well, there's disagreement. Does that mean there's no such thing known as light? There's even disagreement over what energy is. You ask any physicist, what is energy? They're going to go, what? I've never been asked that question because nobody can really define it. But energy exists, even though we might disagree about its nature. If just one action is morally wrong, then God exists and morality is objective. We may disagree over certain things. In the past, certain people thought slavery was right, correct? In fact, many people still think it's right. There's, as you well know, one of the most tragic things about our culture now is the sex slave trade. Now, there's not a person in this room that thinks that's a good thing. But there's some people out there who are doing what? They're suppressing the truth. Most moral disagreement originates as willful denial. We want something, but morality is in the way. We know something is wrong, but we willingly suppress our knowledge of it to get what we want. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1. We suppress the truth and unrighteousness to go our own way. And when people go down that road too far, they may get to an irredeemable point. And if you look at the end of Romans 1, it says that these people not only are doing evil things, they are cheering other people on who are doing them. When the person has reached that level of depravity, there may be no turning back. God gives them up to their desire. So yes, there may be people out there who think there's no problem with rape, there's no problem with murder, there's no problem with sex slave trading, but that doesn't mean that just because some subjects don't agree, that the object doesn't exist. The object, being God, still exists. And so we have done many evil things, and we will continue to do them. So, one other thing about that, also what we're talking about here is the difference between morality and sociology. Morality is how we ought to behave. Sociology is how people do behave. And because there's a difference between the two, that's why we need a Savior. Because we don't live up to the morality that is God's perfect nature.
Martin?
Yes, sir.
This is quite a broad question, but since you brought it up, I gotta ask, how do we fight tolerance? Because the way I see Christianity, one of the worst enemies of Christianity is tolerance. It's taught right from the public schools and forth. I was just wondering, how do we live up to the way Jesus said that he said he didn't tell us to never judge. He just told us how to judge.
Exactly.
And how to not judge.
Yes.
So how do we become like that? You know?
Okay, well, look, here's one thing you can say. Suppose somebody asks you a question about a very controversial issue. And you're on the conservative side of things, you think the other person's on the other side of things. Here's the first question you ought to ask. Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Suppose they ask you, like in our country, there's a big debate over same-sex marriage. Probably the same thing here, right? Suppose they ask you, what do you think about same-sex marriage? What should your first question be? Do you consider yourself a tolerant person? What's the other person going to say? Well, of course I'm a tolerant person. Then what you say is, great, because if I say something you don't agree with, you'll tolerate it then, right? What have you just done? You've just defanged them. Because they can't get all mad at you because they just told you how tolerant they were, right? So then when you give your opinion on the issue, they're going to have to say, okay. Now if they still get mad at you, what you can say to them is, why is it that when you think you're right, you're just right, but when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant? See, tolerance is supposed to mean that you tolerate other viewpoints, you'll hear them even though you don't agree with them. That's the nature of tolerance. You know what tolerance means in our culture now? If you don't agree with me, you're intolerant. Well, wait a minute. You don't agree with me, does that make you intolerant? Of course not. But of course this isn't about reason. It's not about reason at all. What do people tend to do when they don't really have good arguments for their position? Seminarians, you should know this. You should write this in the side, the margin of your notes. If your logic is weak, pound pulpit. Logic weak here, pound pulpit. Get more and more aggressive to try and cover up your lack of logic. That's what people do now. They try and pummel you. They try and shut you down. They try and tell you you have no right to say what you're saying. I've noticed that the people who say they're fighting for tolerance are often the most intolerant people out there. It's their way or the highway. So I think just by asking some questions, you can diffuse the situation. But the last thing we can do is tolerate evil. Once we start tolerating evil, first of all, we're not doing what the Lord told us to do. And secondly, our entire culture is going to continue to go into depravity, and we're going to be the fault of it. In our country, I can tell you this, the reason our country is going bad, it's not because all the godless people over there, it's because the godly people don't stand up. That's the problem. The problem is the church. The problem is not the people who are unbelievers. We're the problem. We don't stand up. We're too meek, we're too quiet, we don't want anybody to call us a bigot or say we're intolerant. Well, newsflash, Jesus said this would happen. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Anybody who lives a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. If you haven't been persecuted yet, I'll let you conclude what the concluding thought is.
Kent?
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. You have talked about moral in general, but I would like to ask you about Christian morality. You stated that there is a thing called Christian morality, and stated it was more detailed than the natural morality. Could you say something about what is Christian morality and how is it better than the natural morality, and is it not just a subject to, for example, zeitgeist?
That's a great question. I would say that there are some things that the Christian morality tells us to do that say you might not immediately know as is an obligation if you didn't have the Bible. For example, the Bible says, take care of orphans and widows. Now, you know that was a good thing to do, but did you have a duty to do it? The Bible is giving you a duty to do that. Take care of all orphans and widows. Help the poor. Share your money with people. Use your money to win people to Christ. Luke 16:9. These are all things that go beyond what a normal moral law might say. If your enemy asks you for something, help him. Pray for your enemies. These are things that go beyond just, you know, don't hurt me, I won't hurt you. So sacrifice, in other words, is a great moral virtue according to the Bible that you might not get by just the basic moral law.
Also, in addition to that, I would add to what Frank said. One of the other unique things about Christian morality is essentially it's self-denial. I mean, Christ said, "Take up your cross and follow me." C.S. Lewis said, if you're picking a religion to follow, don't pick Christianity. He said, if you pick Christianity to make you happy, you're picking the wrong religion. He said, a bottle of port can make you happy, but you know, Christianity is about making you holy. And Christ's morality is actually perfect. In fact, he shows us that we can't even keep his morality, which is why we need him to do it. So it's not one that, like, if we're going to make something up, you know, like we want to follow this. This is what Christ teaches us to do, and that is to be perfect like he's perfect. So it's not an issue of like whether it's superior or whatever to other moralities. It shows us our need for a Savior. Because Christ showed to the Pharisees, they thought that they were keeping the law. They thought they were keeping the morality by actually not doing it. In fact, they said at the time that Christ lived, the Judaism of the day was that if I'm not actually physically committing adultery, then I'm keeping the law. Jesus said, if you have lusted, you have committed adultery already in your heart. So he made it even more difficult to actually live a moral life. So in fact, that's the point of the law in the Old Testament, is to point to our need for someone who can actually keep the law, and that's Christ. So that's what I would add to it.
What if you have Christianity and a bottle of port? Are you even more happy?
Yeah.
Okay.
One last question, I think. Christian, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, since I'm the last one and we've been talking for a long time, I happen to be a moral philosopher, but I won't pose any technical questions. I will pose another question. Why is it interesting to prove the existence of God? Why is it that we want a proof, or we want to believe it? So what I'm asking you is, what is the point about proving when we have to have faith? If you follow me.
Oh yes, excellent question.
And that's the question, because if I may be so blunt, I actually disagree with almost the entire presentation, but that's we could take that in another.
Okay. No.
But my question, I'm very interested in.
Yeah, excellent. Well, it's a two-part question, so two-part answer. The first is there's a difference between belief that and belief in. Belief that is getting evidence that say God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible is true, and we do that because we want to know if it's true before we move to belief in, which is trust in. Belief that is intellectual, and that's what we call reason. That's what evidence is. The Center for Apologetics is devoted to that, giving reasons for why it's true. But belief in isn't just reason. Belief in is volitional as well. So belief that is the head, and belief in is the head and the heart. And most of the time when the Bible's talking about faith, it's talking about belief in, trust in. In fact, a better word in Greek, in English should be trust. I don't know what it would be in Danish. What would be the word for trust in Danish? Okay, that would be the word to use rather than faith. Do you trust in? According to James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote that little book in the New Testament called James, he says, even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. Why? Because they don't trust in Him. They know intellectually better than we do that God exists, but they don't trust in Him. And the reason belief in is important is because it's more a statement of your will. God will not force you into heaven against your will. If you don't want Him now, you're not going to want Him in eternity. When I first met my wife about 28 years ago, I got evidence that she would be a good wife. But all the evidence in the world didn't make her my wife. I had to take a step of trust in her and ask her to be my wife. And in a momentary lapse of judgment, she said yes. That's the difference between belief that and belief in. Now, the other part of your question is, well, who cares, right? What does it matter? Mortimer Adler edited the Great Book series, which you may know about. And the largest section in the Great Book series was, does God exist, or the entry on God. And he was asked once, why is the God section the biggest section of this Great Book series? All these different subjects, and the God section is the biggest. And he said, I suppose, because the question, does God exist, is the most important question to humanity. Because if God exists, we live a certain way. And there's a meaning to life, and we ought to live a certain way directed toward that meaning. If God doesn't exist, then it's a free-for-all. There is no real meaning to life, which means there is no ultimate morality. And so, live however you want to live. If you got to kill your brother, go right ahead. So, the question, does God exist, is literally the most important question to every other subject you can think about. If God exists, we go this way. If God doesn't exist, we go another way. That's why I think it's important. And obviously, if God exists and there is an eternity, what could be more important than eternity? Look, you're going to be dead a lot longer than you're going to be alive. You can be wrong about a lot of things. Right? You can be wrong about football. You can be wrong about business. You can be wrong about whether you're better than Sweden, and Jesper says you are. You can be wrong about a lot of things, but you can't be wrong about eternity. If you're wrong about eternity, that goes on forever. So that's why the God question is important, I think.
Yes. Jesper has an announcement.
Yeah. Should you say it in Danish or? Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, det er bare det for at minde alle folk omkring, at der også vil være en præsentation i morgen, herinde kl. 19:30, hvor det faktisk er for alle KFS og i Aarhus-området, men I er hjertelig velkommen til at komme der også, og han undervise i nogle af de emner, han ikke allerede har dækket, inklusive Jesus opdannelse. Så der skal I også være hjertelig velkommen kl. 19:30 i morgen. Yeah. I'm just saying that actually it's an objective truth that Danes are better than Swedes.
Oh, very good. I told you that earlier.
Yeah, that should be in the Bible.
I told you that.
It should also be in the Bible,
yeah.
Actually, yeah.
One of those other things you get from the Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, we are close to an end now, and I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight and asking questions and comments, and especially I want to thank you, Frank, for giving a
mediocre presentation.
Thought-provoking.
All right.
And stimulating lecture, and for your fine way of answering questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Skulle der være nogen, der ikke har betalt endnu, så er der mulighed for at gøre det her med Jørgen Henrik. Og bøger er til salg for 200 kroner.
De kan betale til op også. Yes. Og vær opmærksom på måske på andre programmer, foredragsserier, ting og sager, der foregår her. Det kan I gå ind og orientere om på Mindesfakultetets hjemmeside, men også på Center for Kristen Apologetik Det er et spændende arbejde at følge med i. Som sagt,